I had a privilege of serving as a senior advisor to IGE between 2008 and 2010. And I come to have a special feelings in marking 20th anniversary of IGE when I reflect that how remarkable contributions and achievement it has made for Korean intellectual community and the Korean economy under the leadership of Dr. Sang-il. This last session, of course, before the wrapping up, is going to discuss the future of global finance. This morning, we have already touched this issue a little bit, but I understand that since 2008 global financial crisis, there have been great effort in global level to strengthen the stability and the function of a global financial system. And I understand these efforts have been concentrated mainly in two aspects of it. There is international monetary system reform and global financial regulatory reform. And I may say that despite a lot of discussions that there has been little progress made in international monetary system reform, except reform of the IMF in its resource and the lending program and also governance, and also perhaps with the SDR allocation as was recognized by Mr. Strauss-Kahn this morning, for which Ted Truman played a great role. On the other hand, I guess there has been some progress in reform of a global regulatory framework, although a lot has is remaining to be tied up. But there has been some agreement and progress, including Basel III and CP issues. As I said, of course, a lot remains to be done. So in this session, I hope that we could touch upon these issues because in the meantime, as was presented by many speakers in this first session, that still international financial system and global financial market is clouded with a lot of uncertainties, including the exit of QEs and also the continuing problems of euro area and perhaps Abenomics and some expected turbulence in the path of reform of Chinese economy in the coming years. So I hope we would be able to discuss these issues in this session. We have indeed very distinguished panel and speakers in this session. Fortunately, we have a keynote speaker for this session. Dr. Kim, the governor of Bank of Korea, will deliver a keynote speech. And if I may briefly introduce him, he has truly impressive and distinguished career. His career spans from a researcher at top think tank of Korea, KDI, and then he became the manager and head of these institutions. Actually, he headed two top think tanks in Korea, including KDI and Korea Institute for Public Finance. And also, he became the policymaker and bureaucrat. He was a special advisor to Deputy Prime Minister and senior secretary to the President of Korea on economic affairs. He was also distinguished academics. He was the Dean of Gyeonggi University and the President of Hallym University. And also he was a diplomat as a Korean envoy to the OECD. And now, finally, he is a central banker. Perhaps the only jobs that I don't find in his bio is politicians, which is not a very popular job these days. But this is, of course, not to suggest him to go this job after, his current position. And we also have three distinguished speakers. Mr. Truman and Mr. Snow have been already introduced in the previous session. Mr. Wolf, he is currently the director of Bruegel, a top think tank in Europe. And his previous positions includes advising the IMF, and he also worked in European Commission and Bundesbank. Right? So it is indeed fortunate that we are able to listen the views of Governor Kim on global financial issues. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium with a big hand.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cho, for a very kind introduction. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be here to deliver the keynote speech at the 20th anniversary conference of the Institute for Global Economics, which is renowned as a leading forum for forecasting changes in the global economic environment and presenting strategic responses to them. I would like to offer my gratitude to Chairman Il Sakong for inviting me on this invaluable occasion, and sincerely congratulate your esteemed organization on its 20th anniversary. The theme of this session is the future of global finance. I believe that our three speakers will cover the topic and the issues related from various perspectives. In the meantime, wearing my hat as a policymaker, I would like to talk about the future of global finance from the perspective of financial regulatory reform. As vividly exemplified by the 2008 global financial crisis, a crisis breaking out in one region spreads quickly to the surrounding areas in this environment of highly interlinked financial markets, rendering no country immune from the effects of a crisis. The huge fall in economic growth rates in the aftermath of the global financial crisis tends to cause permanent costs as countries cannot return to their pre-crisis GDP growth paths even over time, which surely represents huge costs at present values. The international community has therefore determined that what is most crucial above all else is to prevent the recurrence of a crisis. Hence, financial regulatory reforms have been undertaken at the global level. Provided these global financial regulatory reforms are completed and the supervisory authorities' capacities for detecting and curbing financial crises are strengthened further, and market discipline works seamlessly as it should, then we may expect the future of global finance to become more promising. I would now like to explain the causes of the global financial crisis and worldwide efforts to tackle them, and then move on to the challenges ahead in enhancing global financial stability. A consensus seems to have been reached at the global level that the recent global financial crisis was attributable to the accumulation of global imbalances in the real sector and to the buildup of systemic risks in the financial sector. I will dedicate this particular opportunity to analyze the causes of the crisis with a focus on the financial sector, and then explain how efforts in response to them have been made through global financial regulatory reforms. After that, I will point out several future challenges facing us. First of all, I will speak about how the buildup of systemic risks led to the financial crisis. Analyzed from the financial system perspective, the financial crisis was attributable mainly to the rise in systemic risks caused by procyclicality in the time dimension and by interconnectedness in the cross-sectional dimension. Financial regulations have so far been inadequate for curbing the procyclicality and interconnectedness of financial institutions, or have rather amplified them. Procyclicality has been heightened due to the shortcomings of the liquidity and leverage regulations imposed on financial institutions and to capital regulations that rely heavily on internal models. Financial regulations in place are assessed as having failed to prevent the deepening of interconnectedness caused by systemically important banks or shadow banking. With the recent global financial crisis serving as the opportunity, the need has arisen for establishing a global regulatory framework capable of rooting out the accumulation of systemic risks by closely examining the problems of the current financial regulatory system and reforming the problems identified. As part of financial regulatory reforms, efforts have also been made to establish a macroprudential policy framework. This resulted from the insight that as a consequence of the sole focus of central banks on price stability and of supervisory authorities on microprudential issues up to the global financial crisis, the presence of systemic risks was overlooked. In response to the procyclicality and interconnectedness that were the key contributors to systemic risks, efforts at global regulatory reforms have been made worldwide. I would now like to discuss what they are and their progress to date, followed by an assessment. First, to reduce procyclicality, the introduction of a new regulations on liquidity, leverage, and countercyclical capital buffers has been pursued. The liquidity regulations require banks to hold sufficient high-quality liquid assets to respond to possible cash outflows during stress periods and encourage them to finance their long-term assets through stable funding, including capital and long-term debt. The regulations are meant to prevent a situation in which banks invest in high-yield, non-liquid, and long-term assets with short-term marketable funds during upswings, but then conduct a fire sale of their holdings when crisis strikes and it becomes difficult to roll over their funding, thus triggering a collapse in asset prices. Leverage regulations require banks to accumulate capital equivalent to a certain percentage of their on and off-balance sheet exposures. These regulations were designed to complement the drawback of capital regulations. This is because under capital regulations, the risk weights are affected by business cycles, causing banks to supply excessive credit during an upswing when the regulatory capital burden reduces, and to suddenly deleverage assets during a downturn when the regulatory capital burden increases. Countercyclical capital buffers seek to reduce the amplitude of the financial cycle by encouraging banks to accumulate extra capital during good times and draw it down when things turn sour. In order to curb interconnectedness, efforts are being made to introduce new regulations on SIFIs and shadow banking, which have together been pointed to as origins of the global financial crisis due to the complexity of their interlinkages. Along with such efforts, capital regulations have been tightened, and reforms were carried out in the over-the-counter derivatives markets. The regulation of SIFIs is designed to address the too-big-to-fail problem. It imposes a surcharge on SIFIs in proportion to the negative externalities, and their failure would cause, while putting in place resolution procedures in advance so that they could be solved orderly without causing financial system strains if they become insolvent. Tighter shadow banking regulation targets financial institutions that carry out credit intermediation similar to banks, such as repos, MMFs, securities lending, and hedge funds. Shadow banking institutions expand interconnectedness within the financial system through maturity and liquidity transformations and leverage increase, but have been more loosely regulated than banks, causing regulatory arbitrage. Capital requirements focus on improving the quality of regulatory capital by recomposing it around the more loss-absorbent common equity capital, and on expanding its quantity at the same time by increasing the proportion of required capital vis-à-vis risk-weighted assets. It aims to reduce the possibility of one bank's crisis spreading to other banks by strengthening the resilience of individual institutions in the face of external shocks. Reforms of the OTC derivatives market are intended to encourage transactions through trading platforms by standardizing OTC derivatives products and to clear them through a central counterparty and to centrally collect transaction information in a trade repository. Looking into the progress of global regulatory reforms shows that the areas for which reform plans have already been completed are capital, liquidity coverage ratio, SIFI surcharge, and Basel 2.5. Areas for which reform plans are still in progress include the net stable funding ratio, shadow banking regulation, OTC derivatives market reform, and cross-border resolution for SIFIs. Our concern is that plans for OTC derivatives market reform and cross-border resolution for SIFIs are somewhat late off the mark. In order to prevent regulatory arbitrage and enhance the effectiveness of the regulations, the drawing up of concrete plans must be completed as soon as possible. Since each set of regulations has been designed in response to particular needs to mitigate systemic risks in terms of procyclicality and interconnectedness, setting priorities among them is not easy. However, there are two things that I'd like to emphasize here. First of all, given that the argument that simple regulations work better amid high uncertainties is becoming increasingly persuasive, we should strive for greater simplicity and comparability. Secondly, as the stages of development and characteristics differ between the financial market systems of advanced and emerging economies, it is important to design the details of regulations with extra care so that they do not pose obstacles to the development of the financial industry in emerging market economies. It is true that accurately analyzing the impact of regulatory reforms on the global economy is hard, given that a variety of regulations are being introduced simultaneously, and there are some regulations that are still under discussion. However, considering the overall costs and benefits, it is estimated that the positive impact will be much greater in the medium and long term, even though there are some short-term costs incurred. Despite the efforts made so far, we still have many challenges that lie ahead of us. Recently, concerns have been looming over the weakening of momentum in regulatory reform as the global financial markets have somewhat emerged from the financial crisis and the profitability and soundness of global financial companies have improved. Therefore, it is all the more important to maintain the resolution that we had at the initial stage of designing the regulatory reforms and to complete this important task successfully. I would like to mention some challenges that we should pay particular attention to for the successful completion of our mission, that is, enhancing the stability of the global financial system and preventing the recurrence of financial crisis through regulatory reforms. First, the global financial regulatory reforms that are currently being pushed forward were designed based on the lessons learned from the global financial crisis. However, it is highly likely that the next crisis could be triggered by the accumulation of systemic risks in sectors we did not think of. Therefore, we need to make constant efforts to identify early the vulnerabilities in the financial system that could evolve into systemic risks and to analyze in depth whether these vulnerabilities can be adequately contained through the current financial regulations. In particular, close attention needs to be paid to excessive risk-taking in some sectors stemming from prolonged unconventional monetary policies in advanced economies and to the potential for financial market unrest in some emerging market economies in the course of unconventional monetary policy normalization. Moreover, to maintain stable financial markets, the communication channels among the policy authorities of various countries and between the policy authorities and financial institutions within their own country need to be strengthened. Second, in order to manage systemic risks effectively, it is highly necessary to come up with an appropriate macroprudential policy framework at an individual country level. In conducting macroprudential policies, the aim of which is to detect systemic risks early and contain them through appropriate regulatory tools, multiple policy authorities are commonly involved. Therefore, it is essential for the policy authorities to ensure close communication, a clear division of responsibility and authority, and consistency in policy by establishing a formalized institutional framework. The FSOC in the United States and the ESRB in Europe, which was set up for carrying out macroprudential policy after the crisis, are good examples of these institutional frameworks. I believe that central banks need to play an active role within these institutional frameworks, since they have the upper hand in identifying systemic risks in advance through rigorous analysis of macro and financial data, and their independence allows them to conduct policies in a stable manner over a long-term horizon. Third, efforts are needed to resolve without delay the cross-border issues that are important for ensuring a level playing field. It is critical to first establish a strong and consistent resolution regime through agreements between the home and host authorities on GSIPs with business networks across many countries. We need to create an environment in which a host country's policy authorities are granted easy access to the crisis management group of any global systemically important financial institutions that are systemically important for them, even though the home country may deem the share of its GSIP its operation in the relevant host jurisdiction negligible compared to its operations worldwide. Fourth, we should be careful not to let the Basel III regulations generate unintended consequences that may hinder the financial sector's support of the real economy. For example, the net stable funding ratio, which is a regulatory ratio that requires banks' long-term assets to be funded through capital and long-term liabilities, has the potential to erode the intrinsic function of banks' termed maturity transformation. In particular, it is highly likely that the NSFR will have a negative impact on emerging market economies whose bank's business model is retail banking. In emerging markets, shadow banking functions as a provider of diverse financial services to economic agents with difficulties in accessing the traditional banking system, such as small and medium-sized enterprises and low-income households. Thus, careful attention needs to be paid so that applying the international regulations without taking such characteristics into account does not undermine these positive functions. So far, I went over the causes of the global financial crisis, regulatory reform efforts in response made by the international community, and our future tasks. I would like to conclude my presentation by emphasizing a couple of points that I think are important for constructing a bright and promising future for global finance. First, given that international coordination has become difficult as countries become increasingly diverse, the need for policy coordination at the global level is higher than ever before. Further on, we need to mull over the establishment of a global jurisdiction. With the progression of global financial integration, it has become impossible to prevent the possibility of financial crisis occurrence and systemic risk accumulation simply by an individual country's efforts. In particular, policy coordination at the global level is all the more essential for ensuring international consistency in implementing regulation and preventing regulatory arbitrage by securing a level playing field. Second, to prevent the recurrence of the global financial crisis, along with the work of global financial regulatory reforms, efforts should be made to contain vulnerabilities in the real sector, including global imbalances. The general consensus is that beneath the global financial crisis lie global macroeconomic imbalances, including the continuancy of current account surplus in emerging markets and deficits in advanced economies and the consequent flows of capital from the emerging markets to the advanced economies. In particular, in the new global economic environment, where real financial linkages have been strengthened, it is necessary to make efforts to introduce appropriate macroeconomic policies so that systemic risks do not build up and send a negative ripple effect through the real sector. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that financial and economic crises, big and small, such as the Great Depression in the 1930s, have been recurrent in spite of the best efforts in drawing up regulations for their prevention. Therefore, the authorities and market participants need to guard against falling into the complacency that this time is different. And keep in mind the advice of Albert Einstein, who said that the significant problems we have cannot be solved at the same level of thinking with which we created them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to lively exchanges of well thought out opinions at this meeting so that we may seamlessly arrive at the solution of the tasks that lie ahead.
Thank you, Governor, for your very insightful and thoughtful presentation. Among other things, he mentioned that we need to pay attention to excessive risk-taking that could stem from monetary easing of key advanced economies, and also he pointed the potential of financial market unrest that could be experienced by emerging market economies in the course of unwinding of these unconventional monetary policies. I hope you will be able to entertain some of the questions later. Before that, I would like to give applause to our three speakers. First, Mr. Ted Truman. Time is scarce good here too, so may I ask you that you limit your presentation within 10 minutes.
Okay, I think I could do that. I might even beat it. So our topic here is the future of global finance. It's a broad and consequently potentially controversial topic, unlike all the other ones we've been dealing with today. That's supposed to be a joke, by the way. Please laugh. Governor Kim has provided us with a thoughtful overview of his of the challenges facing global finance, and he stressed the role of procyclicality and interconnectedness as causes of the global financial crisis. He reviewed the significant progress that has been made with respect to dealing with these issues, but at the same time noted the weakening momentum supporting reform efforts. He reminded us of the tensions between global and national perspectives in this area, why in effect one size or one set of priorities does not fit all. He stressed the need for cooperation and communication. And he reminded us that there is a macroeconomy too, which is both with its actual and potential imbalances. There is much I agree with him in his remarks, with One exception may be what the chairman just introduced him with, summarized it with, but we could come back to that later. So in some sense, you have to, thinking about the future of global finance, we have to think about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, which is what I propose to do. And I'll make, under the heading of where we've been in the past, I think we all can agree that the international financial system is increasingly integrated and is likely to continue that way. Secondly, we live in, as I mentioned earlier today, a multi-currency system that is no longer dominated by a few currencies, even though the US dollar remains the principal international currency, largely because of its network externalities. Third, the expansion of global finance may be a mixed blessing. There are a number of questions that can be asked about this, but I think the sort of central question is whether policymakers and analysts can distinguish between good and bad financial and other capital flows. So moving to the present, where are we now with respect to global finance? The first point is that in the wake of the global economic and financial crisis, efforts are underway to reinforce and constrain global finance. They take many forms. They're the efforts to reform the financial system, and there are also efforts towards the rethinking policies towards capital movements and their management. But notwithstanding this progress, the controversies remain. One piece of evidence is that the rollout of the IMF's new view on the management of capital flows has been accompanied by disagreement about the roles and responsibilities of source and destination countries, as we have seen, and the controversy surrounding both quantitative easing, Mr. Chairman, and the timing of its tapering, as again Governor Kim reminded us in his own remarks. I'm skipping a little bit, but I want to make sure that I leave time for other people. And the third point is that it follows that continuing controversies surrounding global finance point to the need for more analysis of the underlying issues, transparency and information exchange, and cooperation in seeking common solutions and understandings. And progress on all three aspects is essential if the future global financial system is going to be reasonably stable, which is all I think we can hope for. So now getting to the future. Point number one is the multi-currency financial system is here to stay, and international financial integration is likely to deepen, if more slowly. Efforts to manage or control global finance may well continue, and these efforts may contribute to greater stability. At the same time, they increase the costs and reduce efficiency. On that point, the jury is still out. And this continued evolution underscores the importance of further research and analysis on the one hand, and international cooperation and communication on the other hand, as Governor Kim stressed. Point number two, in an ideal world, our goal would be one system of global finance that applied equally and even-handedly to all nations, creditors, and lenders. While this is a desirable goal, and one that has been articulated by some in the wake of the global financial crisis, and even echoed to some degree in Governor Kim's speech, it is, I think it's fair to say, a distant hope. I will offer to you as Exhibit A for your own little thought experiment the efforts going on in Europe today. It is trying to create a regional, unified financial system. That system rests on 4 pillars: regulation, supervision, resolution, and protection. The Europeans are reasonably close on the first 2. They might get somewhere, but only a halfway house on the third, and on the fourth, they're nowhere. I think it's fair to say at this point. So my last point is that, however, we should not give up on constructive reforms in this area. That's part of our job as policymakers and analysts and think tankers and educators. And for this reason, I support an establishment of and have supported establishment of a global, institutionalized global swap network. It would, to come back to my previous point, it would in effect reinforce at the wholesale level the resolution and protection pillars of the global financial system. And in my view, it is possible to establish such a structure that meets both the needs of the system as a whole and at the same time meets the concerns of central bankers. I have outlined that proposal in various forms and various publications. In the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat myself. It is, I know, a project that is near and dear to the heart of many here in Korea. That is probably an example of a policy promoted by Korea that is both in Korea's interest and in the global interest. So my conclusion is that global finance is a work in progress, and my hope and expectation is that we will see progress, not regression, but the future is not assured. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Truman, for your thought-provoking presentation, and also thank you for keeping the time. I'm sure that we will have a chance to follow up some of the points that was raised by your presentation later. Our next speaker will be Dr. Snow.
I will be very brief as well. I'd basically like to deal with two issues. One is very quickly where we've been, and secondly, not where we'll go, but what we don't understand. In terms of where we've been, here are some suggestive statistics. The US has made more progress than Europe in write-downs of financial institutions. There are still a variety of different regulatory regimes for different countries, and this has been alluded to by both speakers so far, and will probably get a lot more attention in the past. In terms of the IMF's financial stability map, financial stability does not seem to be rising, at least in the course of this year. In fact, in some respects, financial stability is further from our reach. In terms of capital ratios for large U.S. banks, they also seem to be doing better than their European counterparts. If you look at Tier 1 common capital ratios for large U.S. banks and now compare them with European banks, the European banks are not doing as well on average. In terms of capital measures for large U.S. banking organizations, the situation is improving, vulnerabilities are going down. The government deficit and household debt as percentage of GDP is also declining. And so in the United States, a lot has happened in terms of putting its house in order. But in terms overall of the global community in finance, we are still far from home. Now, in order to reach home, it would be important to understand the nature of the problem better. And there are four areas, I think, in which our understanding is very incomplete. Certainly my understanding is very incomplete, and if others have better understanding, please let me know. But we all have alluded to the dangers of systemic risks, and where our understanding falls short is the nature of systemic risk. What is systemic risk? I know that at my institute, as well as in other institutes, the issue of systemic risk is being studied at the microeconomic level in terms of interactions between different financial institutions, and you get very complicated network effects. And if you eliminate one of the nodes in terms of financial interactions among institutions within a country, you can get very surprising reactions in terms of solvency of other institutions that are impossible to predict on the basis of their balance sheets alone. And so the problem of what is systemic risk in terms of the interconnections between financial institutions is something, is a field of study that is still in its infancy, and new types of mathematics and so on will be required to grapple with it properly. And once we've grappled with that, then we will better be able to understand the interactions between real and financial sectors. That is another terribly important area. Now, we know, of course, that systemic relevance is not a property only of financial institutions. Other large enterprises in the real sector can be systemically relevant as well. And once we understand what systemic relevance is, and that is, as I said, a micro-phenomena involving interactions, complicated interactions within networks of organizations, then we'll better be able to understand the interrelation between systemic risk in the financial and the real sectors. I suspect that once we've made more progress in this area, we may reach the conclusion that this problem is simply too difficult for us to get a proper handle on. And then we need to ask ourselves, what sort of decisions do we make under radical uncertainty? And there, economic analysis is still very underdeveloped, but robust decision-making under radical uncertainty is probably an area that we need to look into more. So that's sort of the first area. We don't understand enough about the nature of systemic risks, and how to deal with radical uncertainty in the Knightian sense. Then the second, all these points have indirectly been alluded to by you, but one that you went into in some detail concerned global financial regulation, to which we must append global financial supervision, resolution, and protection. And in terms of regulation, we've made significant progress, as you've said, but in terms of supervision, resolution, and protection, there's still a long way to go. Cross-border issues are one aspect of this. Regulation of shadow banking is another aspect of this, which is particularly difficult, because shadow banks are not the same as banks, but the principles in which shadow banks need to be regulated need in some way to be analogous to the principles of shadow banks. So banking and shadow banking need to be treated analogously, even though they are different creatures. And what exactly that means is something that deserves a lot more attention. The third area where we don't know enough is how to avoid excessive risk-taking. I've alluded to that before. I think definitely the first best policy to avoid excessive risk-taking is to get systemically relevant financial institutions to internalize the externalities, which means to pay for the risks that they generate. And I mentioned mandatory cocoa bonds as one way of doing this, but there are a slew of others, and we need to get a better understanding of what type of policy instruments are in place to generate the proper incentives to internalize the costs of risks that are generated. And once we've tackled that problem, then systemic risk will no longer be a huge problem for the global financial system. And I suspect that that is where a lot of effort should go into, and policymakers, by concentrating on capital buffers and various other aspects to make systems less vulnerable, have so far not devoted enough attention, I believe, to the realignment of incentives. And then the last thing that we do not understand enough about, at least in my opinion, is what are the appropriate boundaries between fiscal and monetary policy? At present, fiscal policy has fallen short in a wide variety of ways, and central bankers are simply meant to be the safety net, making up for mistakes in fiscal policy. That can't possibly be in the public interest. And what exactly the right boundaries between fiscal and monetary policy are, we should look into in much greater detail. And having done so, we will probably need to understand better the interrelation between monetary policy on the one hand, monetary and fiscal policy on the one hand, and structural policies on the other. We know in Europe, for example, that there are a number of structural preconditions that countries need to satisfy in order to get financial help, and that is because structural policies are relevant for the solvency of a country, and therefore structural policies and monetary policies are intimately interrelated. What is the optimal form that this interrelation should take? That is another question, I think, that deserves answer. I know this has been an extremely unsatisfactory presentation because I've just left you with a lot of questions, but there we are. Thank you very much.
Mr. Snow, no, it's not. It's extremely satisfactory presentation, and I particularly liked your last point about the right boundary of monetary policy and fiscal policies. I think this is exactly the issue that was raised in our first session too. The lack of political leaderships actually pushed a lot of things that what they had to do to the shoulder of central bankers. And to some extent, I guess monetary policy and the central banks have saved time for that. Now still the homework has to be done, and we are interested in seeing when and how it would be done. And you provided a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. Our last speaker will be Mr. Wolf.
I would like to thank and congratulate Dr. Isaac Hong for 20 years of IGE. It has been a real pleasure to come here and to listen to all the presentations today, and I think IGE has become a terrific institution driving forward the world economy and the global and the Korean economy. Now, in my remarks today, I wanted to focus on the euro area financial system. And I want to focus on the euro area financial system for two reasons. The first reason is that arguably the euro area financial system is at the heart, at the core of the Eurozone crisis. And certainly, as we have heard this morning, there are still significant risks out there. The second reason being that the euro area banking system in particular is really big. It is so big that it cannot be ignored from a global perspective. And to show this, let me just show you some basic statistics here that show that the banking sector in Europe, with 42 trillion in assets, 43 trillion in assets, far exceeds the banking system in the US and Japan. So clearly, it is a major part of the global banking system. So what really is the problem, the financial problem in Europe? I would argue that before the crisis, a lot of credit was given for the wrong purposes. Now, with the crisis, after the crisis, or during the crisis, too little credit is given to the right purposes. So in other words, we had a mispricing of risk, a misallocation of credit before the crisis, and what we are having now is we are having an insufficient provision of credit to the right purposes. And the question is, why is credit not appropriately given to those firms that need it most and that are productive in Europe, and why is this holding back growth? Now, I think the answer to that question is essentially two answers. The first one, and I'm not gonna show my slides. You find the slides in the booklet, because in 10 minutes it's impossible to show all the slides. So let me just give an open speech here. Now, the first point is financial fragmentation. Dennis Noah has rightly said that financial integration globally will increase, but financial integration in the Eurozone has decreased massively, and we have seen a massive financial fragmentation of the Eurozone system. Now, this means that funding conditions for banks and for corporations now diverge still massively across Eurozone countries, with spreads of 200 to 300 to 400 basis points depending on the country. This is not a sustainable situation for corporations. It's unsustainable for growth and recovery, in particular in the south of Europe. The main reason for that financial fragmentation is the very close linkages between banks, sovereigns, and, of course, the economy at large. The second reason why the financial system in the Eurozone has been dysfunctional is, of course, and Dennis also alluded to it, is the implicit government subsidies that are given to the financial system and that distort proper pricing of risks. Now, let me show to you that indeed funding conditions in the Eurozone financial system are still very different. I mean, this is a risk measure of banking risk, and it shows clearly that there are still very, very different funding. I mean, very different risk prices for banks depending on the country in which they are. Now, of course, this financial crisis is compounded by a crisis of real economic adjustment in period of high debt, what I would call basically a debt deflation problem. And just to explain that debt deflation problem, let me show you 2 or 3 slides. This slide essentially shows the massive divergence of prices that we've seen in the Eurozone since the beginning of its existence, with a gap between Germany and the periphery amounting to 17% in terms of the price level. Now, to close that, essentially there will have to be a reversal in the inflation tendencies, and the question is, how is the Eurozone going to achieve this? And basically what we are seeing at the moment, we are seeing a very clear case of Eurozone disinflationary tendencies. So it's not just that the periphery is running lower inflation rates, it's also that German inflation rate is staying pretty constant, so that the average inflation rate is falling pretty dramatically, and it's by now has been falling since the end of 2012. Now, the problem is with falling, the end of 2011, I'm sorry. So the problem with this is that, of course, falling inflation rates have redistributive consequences for debtors and creditors, and therefore make the deleveraging of the household, the corporate, and the government system in the south of Europe much, much more difficult, undermining the stability of the financial system, in particular in southern Europe. So the financial system, when this shock occurred, has not been able to absorb the shock and actually do what a financial system should be doing in a monetary union, namely absorb risk in a part of the region, provide finance, provide credit, so as to allow a smoothing of the real economy, to allow smoothing of the corporate investment and so on. This has not happened because even before the crisis, the kind of financial integration we have had was insufficient. It was basically concentrated in the interbank market and not in the retail market. Dennis alluded already to the fact that Europe has been slow in the bank restructuring. Just to show this, the euros and also to show that there has been a very strong implicit subsidy. This compares the EU with the United States. You see that in the United States there have been only relatively few cases of bank support at the beginning of the crisis. After that it has really dried down, whereas in the Eurozone state aid cases for a banking system have continued for a very long time. And in contrast to that, in terms of the number of bank failures, there have been very few bank failures in Europe, whereas the US banking system has been massively restructured. So a very different approach between Europe and the US to the banking system. Now, let me conclude by coming to three policy points. What is now needed and why actually next year will be a decisive year for the Eurozone financial system, the Eurozone banking system, and could decide whether Europe will go down the Japanese road or will actually go down a more US-like road in terms of the banking system. Now, I think the first very important policy lesson is that we need a banking system in the Eurozone that operates across borders and is able to absorb shocks, cross-border shocks. Now, for this, you need banks that operate over several countries, that are not national champions, that are less influenced by national industrial policy, and that operate according to an integrated financial market. For that, you need to beef up the policy infrastructure. In other words, you need to create a common supervision for the Eurozone banks, and you need to create a common bank resolution. Now, we have agreed on bank supervision. The Eurozone has by now passed the legislation establishing a new banking supervisor, that is the European Central Bank, which holds responsibility for all banks, for the supervision of all banks in the Eurozone. Now, this has to be complemented by a strong move towards a proper centralized resolution authority that can actually unwind banks throughout the Eurozone and prevent that we get trapped in this implicit subsidy schemes that we have seen so far, and actually move to a scheme that's closer to the US scheme, to an FDIC scheme, where non-viable banks get restructured. Now, the second point on the policy front is that, of course, the banking system as such needs to be rendered more robust to financial shocks. Now, Dennis Snow has mentioned contingent convertible debt instruments, so COCOs or the like. Well, the interesting thing is this is very much the discussion ongoing at the moment among the regulators in Europe. The currently discussed legislation foresees that every bank should have 8% of non-risk weighted capital as debt that can be bailed in case of need. So in other words, if this gets finalized, this legislation that's still under discussion, the Eurozone banking system would move to a scheme where basically up to 8% of non-risk weighted assets can be absorbed. The losses of up to 8% can be absorbed by the bank itself. Of course, the big tension here is one between rules and discretion. You want, on the one hand, you want strict rules. On the other hand, you want some discretion because, of course, every instance and every bank is different. And the big question is, if you accept some discretion, who's going to exercise that discretion, and who's going to hold the institution exercising that discretion to account? And that is something on which Europe has basically no answer defined, because there's no centralized government. Now, the third policy point which I want to point at, and which is a very big structural difference between the US financial system and the European financial system, is the importance of non-bank-based financial intermediation. You call it shadow banking, you call it bond markets, you call it whatever, but let's say everything that's non-bank-based financial intermediation. There, Europe is clearly underdeveloped, and the cross-border dimension of this financial intermediation is also underdeveloped. Now, we know from economics that shocks in a monetary union get absorbed by the financial system, but in the absence of a proper financial system operating cross borders, there can be no risk absorption of shocks. So in other words, the Eurozone needs to start a process of creating a financial system, a non-bank-based financial intermediation system that operates across borders and that can absorb shocks occurring in specific countries, specific corporations, or specific banks. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for very informative presentation on Eurozone financial system and also on your insight. Now we have about 5 minutes left, and the floor is open. So any questions or comments from the floor to Governor and also the speakers in this panel? Mr. Kong. Will you please say your name and affiliation?
Hi, this is Tae-Soo Kang, Bank of Korea. Thank you very much for your presentation. I got a specific question to Mr. Truman. When you mentioned about the source and the destination country, I'm very happy to hear that, because way before it was mainly the burden of proof is rest on disproportionately to the destination country for so-called recipient country of global liquidity flow. But these days, you know, there is some debate is going on that some sort of responsibility is also with the source countries. So I would understand that you mentioned about also you suggested institutionalized global swap network. So I'm very happy to hear that, because this is sort of swap network means sort of same the responsibilities for destination country as well as source countries, right? So and there's a sort of a stream of endeavor from destination countries, which is global financial safety net, so-called GFSN. So do you think this type of endeavor from recipient countries, so-called GFSN, or there are a lot of local currency swaps hanging on these days, this is also categorized as your suggestion as institutionalized global swap network? So that is one kind of as a form of swap networks. Do you think what about your? I want to listen to your ideas about that. Thank you.
Let me take several questions in group. Dr. Lim.
Hi, I'm Won-Hyuk Lim from KDI. I have a question for Dr. Snower. One of the 4 issues you raised at the end included how to avoid excessive risk-taking, and your approach was to internalize externalities. But I wonder, based on your previous discussion of the other issues, if the externalities are so large, whether it's really advisable to try and internalize them, because in other industries we try to take out middlemen and try to simplify the value chain and interaction chain and so on. But as you said, if it becomes much more complex in a network setting, we don't even know what's going to happen and what the extent of externalities is going to be. So I don't know whether, COCOs and internalization of externalities is the right way, or maybe it's more useful to think about putting some restrictions on the kinds of complexities that are generated in the financial system. So I'd like your comment on that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, our time budget is already almost exhausted, but I also would like to have one following up questions. This morning, we found that there's slightly different views from Mr. Snower and Mr. Truman on the changed role of a central bank. Now, since 2008, many central banks have been given a dual mandate. On top of the price stabilities, there is financial stabilities as given as one of their major role. And Mr. Snow this morning said this can raise the conflict of interest and pose potential risk because the monetary easings could be useful for financial stability, but it has direct conflict with the goal of price stability, and there is a quite high risk that the central bank would not be able to compromise these two goals. Then Ted Truman said that, well, not immediately this is a problem, and the U.S. Fed has been doing this job quite well. I would like to benefit, to take, to have the benefit of the presence of Governor Kim here, because in Korea we also, was it last year that Bank of Korea was now given a new mandate of financial stability. So how would the central banks be able to compromise these two very important roles, and how, would it help or undermine the financial stability of a national financial market and also global financial system in the future? I would like to appreciate your insight for that. So, Ted, would you respond first?
Well, let me first say that when you started asking the third question, I thought you were going to pick a fight between me and Mr. But instead you tossed the hot potato to Governor Kim, and I'll be interested to see how he ducks. So on the first point, the responsibilities of source and destination countries, and the link to my thoughts about global financial safety net, just to be clear, I used the issue of the source responsibilities of source and destination countries as an example of where we don't have complete and total agreement about the relative responsibilities, or a appropriate way of assessing whether the inevitable externalities that are, as pointed out this morning by some, the inevitable externalities are ones which are reasonable to think that can be dealt with. I think it's imaginative of you to link that to my proposals for the global financial safety net proposals, and I think in a sense you're certainly right. Though the way I think about these kinds of things, at least in the central bank standpoint, I guess it partly goes to the third question here, is that the safety net would not be automatic. In the olden days, we used to say that access to the Federal Reserve's discount window was a privilege, not a right. Actually, they've changed that now, but it did strike me in the olden days that was not a bad way of thinking about things. In that sense, you have certainly the advantage you have from institutionalizing a safety net or a swap network is that you have the firehouse built, right? The fire engine's in it, right? And you know what you're supposed to do if the fire bell rings, but you need to have a process by which someone calls in to say that there's a fire, and that someone revs up the engine to go out and put out the fire, and that requires two parties to do that. And in that sense, it is, yes, an acknowledgement that there are certain mutuality and interests in these cases, but not that it's obvious that in all cases about whether, I'm not sure this analogy is going to carry me all the way through to this story, in all cases that all fires should be put out, or put it the other way, I guess the right analogy. You need to judge about false alarms, and whether there are going to be false alarms that would unnecessarily bring the fire truck out of the firehouse when it was not otherwise justified. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Snow.
Very briefly, with regard to your question, it's a very good question, and there are two answers to it. The question was that if the externalities are very large, is it possible for small institutions to internalize them? And the simplest answer to this question is, if the externality is really large, then it's likely to wipe out your share price if you issue COCO bonds. And therefore, the simple thing for you to do is not generate the externality. That is, just avoid such systemic risk. And banks' uncertainty aversion is sufficiently strong to cause them to go in that direction. In addition to that, of course, there is a lot of tacit knowledge at the microeconomic level that's impossible to replicate on a regulatory, more centralized level. And so banks will be able to operate on better information than is available to a supervisor. Then with regard to your question concerning potential conflict of objectives between central banks, I think one really should distinguish between the U.S. Fed and other central banks, particularly the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank's objective is largely inflation targeting. The U.S. Fed has a number of targets, including the unemployment rate. To keep that full employment is one of its objectives. And therefore, if it follows a mix of these objectives, it's more easy for it to sacrifice one for the sake of the others, because there's a mix of objectives in its objective function. With regard to the ECB, that's meant to keep inflation under control, and which is a relatively young institution, the danger of damaging its inflation-fighting credentials is large, and it's probably late in the day for us to introduce a different objective function to this body. And other central banks are likely to fall between those two extremes. But I do think that when such a conflict of objective is in evidence, to put both financial market regulation or at least supervision into the same hands as inflation fighting must be a bad idea. We know with the ECB that its first attempt to have an asset quality assessment review, it turned out to be far too generous. And now it's anybody's guess whether it'll be generous again. But everyone knows that if it turns out very harsh, then the ECB could be lighting a fire under its own house.
Thank you. Governor King, any comments or insights that you can share with us?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for raising an important issue. But I don't know whether I can answer such a difficult question within a very short period of time. But let me do my best. It's just like the case of being given a mandate, like a Mission Impossible. But I'll try to do my best. Well, dual mandates, for the case of the Fed, dual mandates include maintaining stable inflation at the same time achieving maximum employment. And in our case, dual mandates include maintaining price stability as well as financial stability. It goes without saying that there are often cases that these two mandates can conflict against each other. But in principle, I'd like to emphasize that these two are basically complementary. You're not able to achieve price stability without financial stability. And so I basically think these two mandates are complementary to each other. But as I said in the beginning, there are often cases where when these two can conflict against each other. Take the example of the time of crisis. When crisis breaks out, the central bank takes a very accommodative monetary policy by increasing the liquidity, and you may guess that in case liquidities are increasing, there is a likelihood that financial stability may not be maintained. And then the question is how to harmonize these two seemingly conflicting objectives during the times of a crisis. I think basically the reason that we come up with the so-called instruments for macroprudential policies was to compromise these two conflicting objectives by introducing and by implementing macroprudential policy. On the one hand, you can maintain the financial stability at the same time by achieving price stability. So by having appropriate instruments for macroprudential policy, I think we are able to achieve both mandates. And I don't know whether this can sufficiently answer your question, but this is the way to answer that.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Wolf, if you don't have anything to add, or just briefly, please.
Yeah, I wanted to react on the macroprudential point and whether or not it is a smart idea to put it in central banks. I mean, I guess one objection I have against this is that it really becomes an issue of, at the end of the day, of accountability and feasibility. Central banks, of course, as Governor Kim rightly pointed out, have the ability to detect financial problems more easily than non-central bank authorities. But certainly they often don't have the tools, and they often don't have the legitimacy to actually do the kind of macroprudential policies that are needed. And I would also be a bit more skeptical on the performance of the macroprudential authorities that we have to date. I mean, we have created a number of macroprudential authorities, certainly in Europe. Now, they have been in existence and have still missed a number of very important macroprudential risks. And the reason for that is very simple, that even if you detect a risk, you don't dare to go after that risk and really tackle that risk unless you really have a lot of political clout. And central banks typically don't have that. So my sense is perhaps it's good from the information point of view, but from the point of view of the actual action, it may be more helpful to have it in a strong independent institution that is close to the government and that can make those macroprudential warnings public.
Thank you. 1 hour and 10 minutes was not sufficient for us to discuss this global financial system issues. But I think we have had a good discussion and identified major challenges faced by global financial system, although we are not sure whether we will be able to address all of these issues. I would like to thank excellent contributions by Governor and Mr. Truman and Mr. Snow and Mr. Wolf. Now I want to close this session, and please join me in giving a big hand to all excellent contributions. Thank you.